They set a table for the city and called it generosity. Crystal chandeliers hung like stars over a line of long tables, each place set with a dozen courses, gleaming silver, folded napkins, shaped like sails. Servers moved with trained choreography. Plates arrived, spoons shone, cameras flashed. At the far end of the hall, a raised platform held an auction stage, clothed in velvet, where the evening spectacle, invitation-only charity gala, advertised as the city's greatest night of giving, would be transacted like fine art. Between the banquet hall and a narrow street, past a lobby that smelled of perfume and lemon polish, was a little window of a different world. King's Café. It fit into an alley, the way a pebble fits into a pocket, small, warm, and stubbornly upright. Against winds of marble and glass, on a hand-lettered chalkboard someone had scrawled today's special. Black coffee, plain, the kind that holds mornings together. Shen Qinghe moved behind her counter like she always did, measured, unhurried, as if each gesture were its own prayer. She polished a cup, then another, then poured. When she first poured coffee for the man who owned half the skyline, she had not known that he would notice anything beyond the foam. She had simply wanted the drink to be true. Bitter enough to wake the tired, thick enough to be comfort, hot enough to lift shoulders. He had watched her work with eyes that rarely looked at people for more than a moment. He had asked her name, she had told him. He had smiled, just a fraction, and left a tip that was more about astonishment than generosity. That minute, in a noise that was not hers to keep, had stayed with her like the smell of roasted beans. I make coffee, she thought. I do one honest thing well. Outside, the Gala's fans idled, like a convoy of drowned promises. Posters in gold leaf called the night a triumph of philanthropy. Inside, the caterers arranged new sets of plates mid-service. The spectacle depended on surplus. A display of abundance so complete it needed constant renewal. Too often the renewal meant throwing out perfectly edible food expired only in the minds of those who equated freshness with a fresh plate instead of a resourced stomach. It was an aesthetic choice, disguised as extravagant. Qinghe had heard stories. People near her café told them in low voices. Platters of untouched lobster tossed into dumpsters for the sake of perfection. Trays of roast turned over, because an influencer had sneezed. Mountains of sides scraped into bins. The city's shelters organized around scraps. Her neighbor's little boy counted his rice in the evening. Her own family made another kind of calculation. Her mother measured offers and marriages the way other women measured flower nests. Careful, used to make something permanent. Her younger brother, obedient at the edges, had learned to count change before he learned to count stars. Her father believed stability came from aligning oneself with the right names, the right tables. They had been poor enough to know hunger, practical enough to know that hunger could be cured sometimes by a good match. They had courted the idea of security for Qinghe like a business proposition. Marry well, and the rest would follow. You must think about your future, her mother said, hands that had calloused over decades curling around a mug. Not everything is pride. Sometimes you must accept help. She had sat with those words, like a stone with a history. Pride had its price. Gratitude had a market. Somewhere between her mother's insistence and the city's glitter, Qinghe had kept a pocket of stubbornness. She would not be traded because she was not a thing. Not that evening. Not ever. There was a suitor tall, rehearsed, all sharp angles, and promises that her parents called Zeeling. He spoke in the silked cadence of entitlement and offered an easy solution. His name would bridge the life her family wanted and the life they feared. He wore sympathy, like an accessory, comfortable, detachable. You would be safe, Z's father said once, as if safety had been a garment. You would not have to worry about food, He let his voice trail off as if the rest could be supplied by the imagination of the listener. Qinghe had refused. It was a wrong decision for the math of her family, but it felt like the only honest one for her soul. She had asked for time and they had given her a calendar of judgments. Her mother had cried and her brother had looked away. The neat plan they had imagined for her life began to crack. On the morning of the gala, a courier from the He Group's public relations team arrived with 2 tickets and a glossy invitation. "We remember you." The note read a line that carried the precise weight of a favor owed. That night, the city's glitter felt especially abrasive. Qinghe closed her café early. May, her assistant, and confidant short, fierce, an organ of laughter helped close the shutters. May had given up college to keep the café warm through winters. She had a willingness the size of a compass. Around them, volunteers from a community kitchen moved through the alley carrying boxes of food rescued from restaurants that had agreed, quietly, to spare what they could. "You sure you want to go?" May asked, handing Qinghe a scarf. The scarf smelled of jasmine and smoke. "I'm not going as anyone's answer," Qinghe said. Her voice was simple, but under it lay a river. "I'm going to see what they do when they call something charity." May squeezed her hand. "Bring the courage pie. Don't let them slice it for you." They arrived from the back service entrance. Security checkpoints handed over the night like a toll booth. Smiles checked, names scanned, coats taken with the same ritual as offering a prayer. The hall swallowed them in its hush. King's eyes landed on a long table draped in velvet where dozens of silver domes waited for the auction's theatrical reveal. Outside windows, the city's skyline was a jagged set of questions. On the far side of the room, Mr. He, the man whose company's logo had become shorthand for empire, moved in a small circle of men and women who performed philanthropy with the precision of a stage crew. He was handsome in the way of people who had never had their needs asked of them. His suits fit like second skins. He laughed with a volume designed for photographs. He could order 1,000 meals as easily as he could snap his fingers and have the room applaud twice more for optics. He was not, on the surface, a villain. He was a man used to being the answer. That night, his speech about generosity was wide and flawless. He spoke of responsibility and of giving back, and cameras leaned in, as if to drink his words. Plates came out as a revelation. First the amuse-bouche, then the sea course, then meat and sweeter things. Each a miniature miracle. The auction went on bidding for couture, for access, for experienced while servers danced the choreography of excess. Qinghe watched and felt something tight as a band tighten around her chest. A child outside the hall had eaten half a bowl of rice that day. Her neighbor had let the last of the porridge cool and kept it for morning. A whole city could be fed with the cast-offs, unless cast-offs had become an insult. She moved slowly to the service doors. Behind them, kitchen staff hurried. In a storm of white and sweat, the maitre d' controlled the traffic with a temper that mistook impatience for authority. Plates came back to the cook, some empty, some barely touched. Servers carried trays that looked like gardens until they were discarded. A line of garbage bags filled faster than one would imagine human hunger could be filled. Her hand found a tray, almost as if muscle memory had taught her fingers to reach. She thought of the way she measured coffee by eye, by warmth, by how the cup felt in both hands. She thought of plates as promises. "We can't take food out," a young server said, startled when she reached for a tray. He looked like a boy, playing the part of a man. "You can," she said quietly. "Do you know anyone hungry?" He blinked. "We're not allowed orders." Possessions labeled as policy. Qinghe felt a small, heated pulse of anger. "Who's hungry is not your policy," she said. The words were soft, but they landed. Phones began to lift like reeds in a river after a stone has been thrown. Curiosity, then attention. An influencer near the stage lifted her phone, motioning to someone. People whispered. The sound of many small clocks The event's threat model had not been to be interrupted by a woman bearing a tray, but the night had a capacity for humiliation, the way a storm has a capacity for rain. Qinghe put the tray on a nearby service cart. She did not think of being heroic. She thought of the child with the half-bowl, of her brother who counted change, of the woman in the shelter who mended hems for a charity that never arrived. She thought of hands that needed holding, not tips for the show. If you want to see how she flips the script, stay with us, May whispered, more a nudge than a command. The first CTA hung like a single lamp over the moment, small and human. If the story pulled at them, if their attention had worth, then the audience could do one small thing. It was humble, not performative. She moved. The hall registered her in the way a camera registers a focus shift. Everything else receded. People looked up from cameras and conversations. Her family's faces rose like a tide in her memory. Her mother's thin hands, her father's practical, tired eyes. They had warned her about reputation and marriage markets. They had argued that standing up sometimes made one a spectacle worse than silence. But Qinghe had never been a business item on anyone's ledger. She stepped onto the floor, past a row of servers who blinked, and let her pass, as if she moved with permission, granted by some grace. The sound shifted, clicks of heels, whispers. At a table, a half-mile of flowers and a dozen men with gold cufflinks watched her walk. On the stage, a host clipped a smile, like a badge. The auction's next item had arrived. A bespoke gown, displayed like a trophy, a symbolic lot for the highest bidder. Someone clapped. Then the clapping settled into the hush before an important decision. Qinghe did not go to the stage. She walked to a side table, piled with plates. She lifted a discarded dish, looked at the food. Still warm, still fragrant. Behind her, someone cleared their throat loudly, as if to remind a girl from a café of her place. "Miss, you can't be," a man began. She lifted the plate and held it for the room to see. Food that would be tossed was appropriate to set before those whose need was real. Her voice held, not brittle, not fragile, an open palm. "This is edible," she said. "This is food. I'm going to take it outside." A ripple went through the hall like a draft. Cameras found her. Laughter broke in one corner, sharp and olfactory with disdain. A woman in pearls raised a fan and hid her chin. The security chief glanced toward the stage, searching for instruction. The host's smile thinned. "You can't." Jess, the man began again, voice higher. The microphone amplified his panic. "I can," she said. "Watch me." Phones recorded. Within minutes, a screen somewhere in the hall uploaded a shaky clip. Within an hour, the clip would have thousands of views. For now, it was a small current, nothing like the river it could become. People leaned in. The spectacle paused to consider that a piece of it might not go on as scheduled. "He's going to be furious," May whispered. Behind her, worry braided into the word like a ribbon. Qinghe moved not with plans for fame, but with the kind of instinct that organizes small things into an honest gesture. She did not steal anything. She did not shout slogans. She took what would be wasted and she carried it out. Outside, cold air hit her face like truth. Behind the service doors, volunteers waited with boxers they had brought from the community kitchen, lids taped tight, hands ready. She arranged the plates on a crate, like someone setting a small altar. Children from the alley hovered, pale against the glow of the hall. Someone pushed a cart with more food, then another, then a small parade of hands. People who had once thought of charity as a spectacle were suddenly part of a living flow. Servers who had been told to discard food found themselves handing trays to hands that needed them. The math of hunger and habit was mercifully simple. Food goes to stomachs, not to the aesthetic of an event. Inside, a ripple of dismay spread like spilled wine. Mr. Heesgaze cut the room. He had been filmed 2 nights before smiling at donors. Tonight, His name was threaded to a roast, to a gesture that would soon be called wasteful. His mouth tightened, and for a moment the man who had practiced benevolence for optics looked less like a benefactor and more like a man finally given a mirror. On the hall floor, Zeeling appeared as if summoned by the alarm of propriety. He was fastidious, a man who counted everything except other people's dignity. "This is absurd," he said. His voice carried like a blade. "You can stop this," the security chief whispered, hands moving toward Qinghe, as if she were an object that could be removed. Two men in suits approached, confidence taught into their shoulders. Qinghe stood between the hall and the street, a line drawn in her body. "It's not absurd," she said, to the room, "because when people are hungry, absurd is what their need looks like, to those whose appetite is always fed. It's not charity, if it's performance." A camera found. He and then the sun, the air, the quietly observant man whose presence at the gala had been more background than headline. He moved with a careful unhurriedness, not the brazen posture of his father, but with a steadiness that could be a kind of courage. He had watched the coffee pour from her hands once, and had felt something shift inside him that did not like waste. He had used wealth as a shield and sometimes as a solution, but compassion had lodged in him like a splinter he had never pried out. He met her eyes across the doors, and in that small meeting, something unspoken passed. Gratitude, recognition, the memory of a hand that offered a warm cup when nothing else would. He approached the service door, walking slow enough that people could read his movement for motives. "She has a right to do this," he said quietly into the room. His voice was careful with the vulnerability of someone who had learned his way around fragility. The hall registered it like a new chord. For a man born to be obeyed, the intervention was small but consequential. Mr. He's jaw worked. He had cultivated a brand that required more than the occasional apology. What the cameras captured would be, compared to a fortnight of press releases. He felt the prickle of reputation like insects on the skin. His voice came out controlled, measured, an attempt at calm that asked the room to accept his narrative. "We support sustainable practice," he said. "We will review." Review was another word for time, another word for postponement. "You don't have to review," Qinghe said. "You can act now. There are people cold outside. There are people who could use that supper." A reporter scrambled forward with a microphone like a small, hungry bird. "What do you think, Mr. He asked. "Is this a reflection of your policies?" "We will address it," Mr. He insisted. "We will make appropriate adjustments." At that precise breath, the sound of phones rising altered the room from a place to a chorus. Clips of the scene: the cafe girl carrying trays, volunteers receiving food, a man in a suit stepping into the doorway with a protective posture spread like oil on water. The Gala's curated narrative had encountered a disruptive human story that refused to be smoothed. Zeeling's face turned white at the sight of his name, trending beside the word waste. He had investments tied to the night's goodwill. He had alliances that depended on smooth optics. "She can't be allowed to," he spat. But the sentence broke on the sight of Hee-yeon, standing so plainly in the doorway. He had the look of someone whose fragility made him kinder, and whose kindness made the brittle anger of the room feel sudden and naked. "You are making a scene," someone hissed from the floor. A woman in diamonds pointed an accusing finger at Qinghe, as if she had stolen currency, not fed humans. Qinghe felt the press of judgment like pressure on her ribs. She thought, briefly, of slipping into the night, with nothing but the warmth of having done what she could. She also thought of the old woman who mended clothes for shelter, whose fingers had done more for the city than any gala ever had. She did not run. "You came here for the gala," she said to the assembled crowd, her voice clearer now, for losing the tremor and finding its own tone. "You stand in a hall full of food and call it charity? Look outside." There is a line of people who were not invited. There is hunger that is not a narrative. If you are truly generous, you will redistribute what is being wasted. If you're afraid of losing the look of it, then you have lost more than a plate. Her words landed. They were not a sermon but a clarity that hurt, like a splinter pulled out. The room gasped. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few cameras fed live. A few watchers posted short, furious captions. The air smelled suddenly of something else, not perfume, but a public conscience waking. A man in a suit reached for her arm. It was the move of someone who believed control could be restored by force. For a moment, the world slowed to the thud of the man's hand, and the quick counterpulse of the room's heartbeat. He unstepped forward, and gently placed his hand over the man's wrist. Not in grand obstruction, but in a careful, protective gesture. "Leave her," he said. His voice was low enough that only the front row could hear, but it carried in the way kindness does. Quietly, but so close it became impossible to ignore. The security man recoiled, surprised. No one had commanded him to stop. He had been waiting for permission to use his authority. In the small pause that followed, the room became a stage of new alliances and old pretenses. Mr. He's face was a study in composure being carved away, and then the microphones filled with static, as someone tried to steer the narrative back to the auction. "Please, ladies and gentlemen," the host said, voice brittle with the evening's new strain. "We have an important item." "We have people," Qinghe answered. Her words would be clipped and replayed, edited and shared, argued over by columnists and commentators, until they wore thin. For now they were honest and raw. The first swirl of applause came from an unexpected quarter. Servers who had chosen, quietly, to hand food to those outside. It was small, a clapping of palms stained with flour, but it sent up a tendril of sound that could not be revoked. Someone in the crowd stood, and then another. Phones turned to face them like witnesses. Within minutes, the hall's atmosphere recalibrated into something unsteady. Conversations that had previously been statements of power turned into questions. Mr. He's people converged, whispering sharp and fast. Xiaoling's mouth looked like an animal, trying to sort words from teeth. Reporters scribbled. Outside, volunteers set up an impromptu distribution line under the halo of work lamps, passing plates that had been meant for one elite, round mouths that needed them. Mei hovered behind Qinghe, with a look that was half fear, half pride. "You did this," she said, meaning both the small miracle and the inevitable return wave of consequence. King's chest felt raw, in a way that had nothing to do with the possibility of punishment. She felt exposed in a good way, as if a window had been opened and fresh air was finally coming through. She had struck a match against the night, and the match had not immediately gone out. Her mother's voice threaded into her memory, asking for prudence. Her family's ledger still had numbers that needed balancing. She knew retribution could be immediate. She could lose opportunity. Her family's precarious alliances could fray. The Z family could press for humiliation. Power knew how to retaliate. She also knew that the small action of choosing to feed someone when you could have left them hungry was a measure of humanity she could not bargain away. In the center of the hall, Mr. He lifted a fork to his lips, as if to test whether the meal tasted different under the weight of scrutiny. He tasted an echo. The cutlery clattered once, not loudly, but enough. He leaned into a private conversation with a board member. Words were exchanged and breaths clipped with calculation. The cameras did not catch the content, only the intent. Hyun stepped back into the doorway, watching the volunteers outside. He had a way of looking like he was seeing the world for the first time, tired and new at once. His hand brushed the lapel of his jacket. He was a man, accustomed to people, who performed strength. Now, he had a choice to make that required something deeper than the performance. "Promise me you won't get hurt," Mei said, in a voice threaded with the very human terror of losing somebody to the maw of public life. "I won't be traded," Qinghe said, and this time the internal voice was not a private vow but a public declaration. "I will not be sold." I will not be silenced. From the raised platform came a sound like a gavel. The auctioneer shouted for attention, as if business could be unfazed by moral disturbance. Mr. He rose then, and for a sliver of a moment, he looked like a man balancing a set of scales where one side was his reputation, and the other the lives he touched. You have disrupted a private event, he said, his voice controlled, and changed the experience for donors who support our causes. You have disrupted people's lives, Qinghe said, returning his look with a plainness that did not flinch. Tonight, this hall could have fed hundreds outside. Inside you kept 1,000 plates for a few tables. That is not charity, that is performance. The room split into murmurs. Some in the crowd looked toward the portable line outside, at the makeshift tables where plates of roast and rice were being handed to people, with hands that trembled under the weight of relief. Others looked at the stage, where Mr. Yi's powers were still, for a moment, functionally intact. Mr. He's face changed. A slow, private cracking. We act responsibly, he said, voice brittle, with practiced defense. We will evaluate the situation and take appropriate steps. Appropriate steps. Review. The words tasted like delay. Qinghe's anger coiled, not into violence but into a sharpened insistence. Appropriate steps are meaningless right now, she said. You can give the food out now, or you can shut the doors and let hungry people starve, while you polish your image. There was a flicker of movement behind Mr. He. A board member, thin and precise, leaned forward. We cannot permit this, she hissed. The night is ruined already. No, He-Yan said, surprising the woman into silence by placing his hand on the arm of the service door and stepping out. I think we can. I think we should. If we are honest about responsibility, we act now. The room stilled. His voice was not an order but a plea shaped into a practical instruction. It had the weight of an heir choosing a side. For Mr. He, it was a risk. For He-Yan, it was a declaration that friction could be the beginning of something. Roars of disapproval rose from a cluster of donors. The host attempted to steer them back to the auction. Tonight is about generosity, she began, but the generosity they spoke of had been reframed into something immediate that could no longer be postponed. The security chief moved toward the doorway. Someone in the front rows muttered about protocols. Ziling gripped the edge of his chair so hard his knuckles whitened. The cameras stayed hungry in the room, previously composed, now felt like an animal at a scent. At that moment a young server, who had earlier hesitated at Qinghe's reach, walked into the hall carrying a tray stacked high with modest plates. He set them on a table at the side and, without ceremony, began handing them to the first group of people who had stood up in support. The motion was not dramatic. It was simply a choice to be humane when Grandma used nice words, and no concrete action. It mattered. Words were said then aloud, and in whispers about the propriety of giving, about the tax incentives that people liked to parade, about the optics of wealth. But outside the doors, people ate. They laughed, a small laugh that came from the easy gratitude of having been seen. Someone who had been at the edge of breakdown sat back with a plate in both hands, and closed their eyes as if the world had been nudged back into a place where survival was possible. For a moment, the tide of public sentiment seemed to shift. Clips played on phones. Village girl feeds the city, someone said in a caption later. The phrase had the potential to be reductive, yet for the time being, it contained the truth that a simple, honest act had exposed a fissure in the gilded floor. Ziling, white-faced, rose and stormed toward the exit, leaving a wake of offended patrons. You can't let these people, he said, breathless with entitlement. You can't let hunger be a performance, Qinghe said, answering him not with anger but with a clarity that felt like a blade of clean light. The hall thrummed with decisions. Mr. He retreated briefly into a pocket of confidants to measure damage and manage spin. Hyun remained by the doorway, his presence, now a small, solid island of defiance. "Will you take responsibility?" Qinghe asked him quietly when he stepped closer after the initial turbulence, as if the world had shrunk enough to allow private conversation, not from behind a statement, but now. "Will you help get this food to those who need it, and change the policy so this doesn't happen again?" He looked at her for a long time, as if evaluating whether the warmth she gave was something he could accept without needing to correct it with money. "I don't want anyone to be used for optics," he said. "If I can help, I will. But your safety." "I will not be traded," she said, and the sentence was an anchor. "I will not be bargaining chip." His eyes softened. "I know your name." It wasn't a claim of possession. It was recognition. "You served me coffee once." "I remember." The memory buoyed something fragile in him. The quiet intimacy of being seen without being consumed. "We will make a plan," he said, voice low. "I can pressure for immediate distribution. We can reroute tonight's leftovers to the shelters, and start a program for future banquets. Not just apologies action, Qinghe." Let the possibility sit like a warm cup in her palms. She believed actions better than words, but sometimes a plan was the shape of an action yet to be taken. From somewhere within the hall a man's voice rose. "We must preserve the bidder's experience." It was a cry that mistook money for humanity. The protest dissolved into argument. The cameras continued their impatient breath. A cluster of donors began to chant thinly, "Refunds! Refunds!" as if money could cancel the fact that food had been given to those who had not been prioritized before. The absurdity of it caught even some of the guests off guard. The problem was no longer only a moral question. It had leapt into the mechanics of institution. If Mr. He's company was to maintain its sponsors, it could not be seen as wasteful. If the city was to feed the hungry on the backs of spectacle, it would never be honest. The contest that had been set out was about who would control the narrative. "You have started something you cannot stop," Mr. He said when, a half hour later, he re-entered the doorway with his public face set like a mask. The hall had simmered into a new energy. People were no longer merely observers, and if we must stop it, Qinghe answered, facing him fully now, so that cameras picked them both up in the same frame. "Then, stop being part of it." He exhaled sharply. He had power. He had resources. He had counsel. He also had a father's image to maintain, a board to soothe, and an empire that disliked the taste of scandal. He could command an apology whipped like cream, or he could carve policy like bread and hand it to people. Outside, volunteers continued distributing plates. A small boy with rice on his cheek grinned like someone who had been given an undeserved miracle. It was not a miracle to provide food. It was a reckoning. In the moment before Mr. He spoke, before his reply could become a statement, the room held its breath. Cameras were on. People had bets inside their heads about whether this would pass into history as a scandal or a turning point. Faces were lit by screens and conscience. King's hands were clean of pretense and full of purpose. She had been invited, literally and figuratively, into a room where decisions were made about people like her. She had refused to be a footnote in someone else's ledger. He Yan's hand brushed hers, for a fraction of a second, as he stepped past, not with the possessiveness of a savior but with the steadiness of an ally who had chosen to stand. The touch was a small, mutual recognition. Mr. He lifted the microphone. The world seemed to tilt towards the sound of his voice. The future of a small cafe girl's courage, and a house of polished plates, balanced on the edge of a sentence. The hall waited for whether the next words would be a dismissal or a promise. The cameras adjusted their focus. The volunteers outside waited with the trays they had saved, and the city patient and hungry. If change would come, it would not be from rhetoric alone. It would be from the step that followed his words. If you feel moved by what she did, if this touched something inside you, consider supporting local food rescue efforts, or organizations that connect surplus to need. Even a small gesture can help rewrite how a city feeds its children. They all listened as Mr. He opened his mouth to speak, the microphone catching his breath like an instrument about to play a key. The hall leaned forward. The plates, the scarves, the pearls, the tables of shining silver all waited to see which story the night would choose to be. Mr. He held the microphone, as if it were a tool he had been taught to use to shape opinion. For a moment he measured his breath, let the hall lean toward him the way an audience leans toward a conductor before the first downbeat. He chose words that had been polished in boardrooms. Responsibility, stewardship, commitment. He acknowledged the disturbance and act that in another life might have been called a misdepend. He promised a review, reassessment, a future statement. The microphones carried his practiced cadence, but the tremor in the room was already beyond rhetoric. He stopped speaking mid-sentence when Ian's voice, quietly precise, came from the doorway and cut the air in a way a scalpel cuts silk. "We can do more than review," Ian said. "Right now, we can finish this night by feeding people who are out there waiting." Mr. He's jaw tightened. He turned his head toward his son. A private calculus made a visible map across his face. Cameras pivoted. For someone whose life had been a steady accrua of acquiescence, Hyun's forwardness read like an accusation and a plea in the same breath. The board murmured. A woman in a pearl necklace pinched the bridge of her nose as if to stop a headache. Ziling, who had not yet reconciled to being appended from his comfortable narrative, began to mutter about donors and the sanctity of events. The host blinked, the smile faltering. Qinghe watched them all, not to measure victory, but to see whether the human world could bend toward simple remediation. Her chest still buzzed from the adrenaline, and from the odd, luminous clarity that comes when you name what is true. "I would not be traded," she told herself again. "I would not be bargaining chip." Hyun's voice, when he spoke again, was low enough to be intimate and public at once. "We will open the doors. We will hand these plates out with dignity. And after tonight, we will form a unit to make sure this never happens in our events again. Procedures, partnerships, real oversight. If you're a sponsor and you're leaving because someone chose humanity over optics, you can leave, but we will not hide behind reviews while people go hungry." Something shifted in the hall. It was not only fear of public fallout, although that was there, but the recognition that a man of power had chosen to use what power he had to do something immediate and visible. Mr. He's face, a study in inward negotiation, softened in a way that did not make him small. It made his options visible. He clasped the microphone with both hands, as if studying the future. "All right," he said finally, "we will redistribute tonight. Security will assist. Volunteers will coordinate with the shelter partners we already work with." It was less than what Qinghe wanted, and more than she expected. It was enough to tip a night toward consequence. Outside the doors, the line extended, and the air smelled of rice and steam. People who had resigned to empty evenings tasted something unfamiliar relief that did not require they perform gratitude to earn it. Volunteers moved like a crew that had rehearsed a different kind of choreography past. Conversations offered, names asked and remembered. Photographs of the moment of polished silverware being used to feed hands that had not been invited to the Gala spread across feeds like a bright stain. Within hours, the city's narrative had rearranged itself. The clip of a café girl carrying plates from the banquet to the street threaded through feeds with captions, "From dish to compass," "When charity stops being a show," and in less flattering corners, "Stunt." Columns balanced on the pivot of opinion. Late-night commentators repeated lines about tact and timing, yet there was a counterweight, a string of small non-profits, posting their gratitude and an influx of offers to partner on real redistribution systems. Power, once nudged, wants to balance itself against optics. There were angry calls, donors who wanted refunds, sponsors who threatened to pull funding if the evening's tone soured. Mr. He's counsel circled him with spreadsheets and reputations like armor. Zealing fumed in the wings, tasting a future where his polished alliances might be less gleaming. But Hien had lit a fuse he did not intend to explode. Instead, he was trying to channel the energy into something structural. He called for an emergency meeting with a set of demands that sounded shockingly like a plan. Immediate distribution protocols for all events, mandatory donation timelines, an independent oversight committee including members from community groups, funding for a community kitchen pilot, in a liaison, to work with local shelters to ensure food safety and logistics. Bold, said one director, in the clipped way of someone who ranked risk under 5 categories. Necessary, Yan said simply. He looked tired in a way that was not weakness, more like the worn tiredness of someone who had spent long hours counting his own misalignments. This is about responsibility beyond statements. We have the means to organize. If we truly believe in giving, we stop giving as spectacle and start giving as action. The board debated. The arguments were procedural and sharp. Men talked about liability and donor sentiment and operational costs. Women tried to steer the conversation toward precedent and long-term brand risk. Mr. He listened as if new angles of his life were rearranging like chess pieces. For a man whose identity had often been constructed of careful performances, this felt like the first time the stakes were not merely material. Eventually, chosen by pressure and the camera's unblinking gaze, the He group announced the formation of a program. The Serve Forward Initiative. It would gather surplus from catered events, preserve edible food for immediate redistribution, and fund a community kitchen pilot to process and prepare food safely for distribution. An independent advisory board would include community leaders, one of whom, unsolicited, recommended Shen Qinghe. When Yan offered to speak, he did so with a steadiness that did not hide how much it cost him. Tonight taught us how fragile our gestures can be. We will do better, he said. There were cameras. His voice did not seek to dominate but to offer accountability. The statement was short and actionable enough to be reported without being eaten by the usual swirl of corporate speak. The following morning the social feeds were a mixture of outrage and praise. Some interpreted the change as PR. Others, as a genuine turn. Voices that had been quiet now spoke. Local food rescue networks posted that they had received early volunteer calls and logistical support. Smaller restaurants, inspired by the attention, signed up to donate unsold food that day to shelters. King's phone did not stop vibrating. There were messages of gratitude, some of incredulous criticism, and a few that were bluntly transactional offers of money. Proposals to use her name as a brand. She sifted through them at her counter between brewing coffee and measuring out beans with the same hands that had once tamped a portafilter, while watching city lights pollute the horizon. Her family watched the developments in their own way. Her mother called first, voice a blend of worry and relief, asking about safety, about whether she had eaten, about what this would mean, in practical terms. The conversation pulled them into the persistent calculus they had always used. What is reputation now worth? And will this set them right? People are talking, her father said when Qinghe visited them that afternoon, his tone a ledger opening. This could help all of us. Maybe it's time to reconsider Zealing. She had expected this line. Families evaluate new information through a lens of survival. She also expected knew it would be given in exchange. I'm not a stepping stone, she said, softer this time than when she'd refused the first time. If you think my life is a bridge for convenience, then we don't have the same measures. Her mother's relief strained into frustration. We can be practical and still keep dignity, she said, as if the two were not often at odds. For her parents, the public attention was currency, and currency answered many immediate worries. Qinghe listened, not to sign a different contract but to demonstrate that her decisions were not made for spectacle. She understood their fear. She understood the calculations. She also knew the price of being sold. If safety comes with being traded, then I will choose risk, she replied. I will not be a commodity. Outside, Mei rallied volunteers for an after-school program. Qinghe wanted to start an idea born not of the news cycles but of the children who passed the cafe window on their way home. We'll teach them to cook, to plan, to run a small business, Mei said. Eyes already drafting lists. You gave them plates. Keep giving them skills so they can make their own plates. Negotiations began that week in offices that smelled of new paper and old money. Hyun wanted a direct liaison to the community kitchen pilot and insisted, softly but firmly, that the community decide who would run it. He suggested that someone with practical experience and trust in the neighborhood should be in charge. Several advisors suggested an established non-profit. Someone suggested King's name with a tentative reverence of someone placing a delicate cup on a table. When they offered to make her the program's face, to sit on the advisory board and sign the press statements, she said no. I will not be your symbol, she told the liaison in a meeting where the lights were bright and the stakes politely framed. I will run it, or I will leave. No second-hand promises, no photo ops where I stand like a prop. If you want me involved, you give control to the community. Control, not just in name but in operations. Hyun looked at her across the room in a way that read like permission. He was used to privilege translating into solutions. She asked instead for work, and his eyes, for once, were quieter than action. We can structure it that way, he said. We can fund, without commandeering. We can hire local managers and let them make real operational decisions. They drew up terms that read like compromise shaped by respect. Funding that would pay staff wages and overhead. An oversight board, including community members. Transparent, quarterly reporting, and an emergency clause that forbade corporate interference in daily operations. Crucially, Qinghe's role, if she accepted, would not be merely ceremonial. She would be offered a position that carried decision-making power, and a salary that could support the program's launch. The company would commit to scaling the model if pilot results showed impact. But the terms were specific. No forced branding using King's name. No exclusivity that would tie the program's identity to the company's PR cycles. Qinghe considered the offer. While cleaning a grinder, she liked the practical rhythm of work. The calibration of grind and time and the offer's terms resonated with the same honest labor she practiced daily. She also considered the moral danger of being absorbed into a company's image. You can fund programs without owning their souls, she said aloud once. The words forming from the same place that had unlaced her from a wedding contract months earlier. When the press conference came, the hall smelled different from the prior night. Less of perfume and more of paper and coffee and a cautious optimism. Mr. He read a short, tightly vetted statement about policy change and the Serve Forward initiative. He announced a monthly donation schedule and the formation of the Independent Oversight Board. He thanked those who had called the company to attention and said the company sought to repair public trust. But he did not dominate the stage. Hyun stood beside him, the visible offer of an heir taking responsibility. When Qinghe stepped up at the latter part of the event, an invitation extended by Hyun's insistence, not by the PR team, she did not speak to soften, or to make the company look luminous. She spoke the way one measures coffee. Precise, honest, and brief. You do not have to make charity into a show, she said to the microphones and the cameras and the people watching on screens. You can serve without spectacle. If our city has learned anything tonight, let it be that food is not a prop. Let us make systems that feed people, and enable people to feed themselves. Her words were simple. They landed not as a sermon but as a set of instructions. They were not a demand for glory. They were a demand for labor and care. The Serve Forward initiative launched with a pilot community kitchen housed in a repurposed lot near the café. It ran on both money and sweat. He Group provided funds, local restaurants donated surplus, and community volunteers turned that surplus into safe, nourishing meals. Servers from the Gala, of whom had been scolded for their hesitations, signed up to help, their faces lit not by chandeliers, but by the warm business of hands doing useful things. Hien invested not only money, but time. He put his influence behind the program's logistical partnerships and insisted on transparency. He also began attending therapy sessions publicly, not as performance, but as a sign of someone who was trying to make his choices sustainable. In an op-ed, he later wrote, he acknowledged that privilege requires both recognition and maintenance. He described therapy as work I owe to myself, and to the people who will one day rely on me in different ways. He wrote words that were read as part of a longer, human arc. The He family matriarch, who had initially bristled at the notion of reputation being unsettled, surprised many by donating a grant for the kitchen's refrigerators practical, solid, and unlikely to be used as a hashtag. She visited once, arrived in a modest car, and stayed long enough to see how the line moved. She watched as people took trays that had once been part of an evening's glitter, and set them before others who needed them. Her face did not become saintly, it became quieter, lined with an acknowledgement that wealth might be used differently. Ziling, who had hoped to gain a certain leverage from the Gala's success, found his place shifting. Some allies who had once whispered with him now avoided his calls. Donor lists rebalanced with people seeking lower-profile philanthropy that listened to community input. It was not a dramatic fall. It was a slow, grammar change. Where once he had been a subject of polite attention, he became a small, sharp example of the limits of transactional relationships. Shen Qinghe turned down several offers from marketing outfits that suggested her image could be monetized to sell soup or authentic experiences. She accepted instead a role that paid fairly, and gave her autonomy to hire her staff and choose the kitchen's menu. The pilot program's bylaws insisted on community hiring and prioritized local procurement. The initial evaluations were encouraging. The pilots saved significant amounts of edible food from waste and delivered meals to shelters and to families. On a sliding scale, her parents, watching the program's slow but tangible success, shifted too. The ledger they had used to assess King's life began to include variables for pride and for the practical ways a neighborhood could be lifted. Her father came to the opening day of the community kitchen, apron tied clumsily around his waist, and served rice with a hand that had once only balanced accounts. His pride was not silent, it was messy and human. He hugged his daughter in front of a line of people and said, voice thick, you did the right thing. I was blind to other ways of being safe. Not every change was smooth. The program faced logistical challenges, refrigeration hiccups, miscommunications with donors, and the endless friction of bureaucracy. There were nights when plates were insufficient, and the volunteers worked past midnight, tired and sore. There were policy debates about evaluation metrics, and there were criticisms that any corporate funding risked co-option. The Oversight Committee fought, as committees do, to keep the program true to its aim. The community pushed back against free-floating PR. Through all of it, Shen Qinghe's steady, practical dignity persisted. She organized training sessions for youth, teaching not just recipes but supply chains, basic accounting, and how to handle volunteers. She established a small microloan fund for neighborhood entrepreneurs to buy equipment. May helped run the café's expansion into a small meeting room where community education classes could take place. The wedding dress auction that had been part of a prior gala became unexpectedly symbolic. A volunteer suggested that the couture fabric be converted into aprons for the kitchen staff. The gesture was small and perfectly literal, the dress given new life as something that enabled service rather than spectacle. He had never told her what to do. He offered logistics, funds, and sometimes a quiet shoulder in the late nights when the paperwork piled up. He did not attempt to rescue. He listened, to the point that Qinghe began to trust his involvement as a kind of covenant. He would be a partner in capacity, without buying authorship of the project. Their relationship, if it had a label at all, was an evolving friendship edged with gratitude and a fragile mutual curiosity. On occasion, the relationship felt like a rehearsal for something deeper that might one day happen. But there were no rushes, no purchases of affection. He respected her refusal to be an ornament, and treated her refusal as a reasonable boundary. One evening, after the kitchen had been running for 3 months, the team held a small celebration not for press, but for volunteers. The long tables that had once been set under chandeliers were replaced by folding tables under string lights. The food was the product of systems. Rescued bread turned into bread pudding, leftover roast reimagined into hearty stews, vegetables that would have been discarded braised into sauces. Children from the neighborhood queued up for plates while volunteers explained where the ingredients had come from. Qinghe moved among them like a person who belonged to a thing she had built. She laughed with a woman who had come to volunteer after seeing the clip on a feed. She taught a boy how to fold a napkin. She felt the thing she had wanted not in the headlines but in the clatter of forks and the murmur of people eating without performance. Hien found her by the coffee station she'd insisted on keeping as a small hub inside the kitchen, a place where the smell of beans calmed the business of the day. He poured 2 cups and handed one to her. "You've done more than scold a room," he said, not needing to embellish. "You made work." She took the cup and warmed her hands around it, the way she always had. For a moment, they stood in that comfortable silence that had once been their first thin exchange to people who had shared a small kindness and found it had ripple effects. "You could have used me as an image," she said, looking him in the eye. Not angry, but honest. "You didn't. I appreciate that. I didn't want to buy your dignity," he said. "I wanted to earn a place beside it." She considered that. There is a difference, she thought, between buying and earning. "I don't need you to earn me," she replied. "I need you to be reliable." Her voice had the calm of someone who had learned something about what she could ask for. Reliability is the kind of gesture that lasts. He smiled, small and a little melancholy. "Then, let me be reliable," he said. "Not in promises, but in work. And I'll go to therapy because I want to be better. Not because it looks good." They drank the coffee. It was simple and bitter and perfect. The months that followed were a slow accumulation of small shifts. The Serve Forward initiative published quarterly reports. They showed reduced waste at events that partnered with the program and an increase in rescued food distributed to shelters. He Group adjusted its event policies to include mandatory donation plans and an independent compliance officer. The city council, irritated and then compelled by public pressure, opened a dialogue about municipal incentives for businesses that partnered with food rescue organizations. Other corporations began to mimic He Group's program, some out of genuine interest, others out of competitive necessity. The conversation moved from single-night spectacles to system design. Not all critics were mollified. There were op-eds that called Qinghe's action a stunt, or accused corporations of co-opting community labor. There were nights she read comments that sought to diminish her motives. Hunger, she learned, is not only about food. Some people hunger for narratives that confirm their assumptions. Any disruption of that hunger created friction. She learned to brace without hardening. One afternoon, a year after the banquet, the same hall that had once celebrated excess hosted a different kind of gathering, a public forum on sustainable hospitality. Mr. He attended, less polished but more present, as if his edges had been smoothed by collision with the city's messy needs. He spoke about accountability in plain terms, and introduced a new report on event sustainability. Hien presented a section on community partnership models. Qinghe was invited to the podium, not as a prop, but as a panelist, a working member of the Serve Forward Oversight Committee. She spoke of dignity and logistics, of slips and successes, in a voice that did not aim for applause, but for change. Later that night, as volunteers folded chairs and wiped down tables, a young woman approached Qinghe. She had been in the shelter line a year before, she told Qinghe. And now she ran a small catering business that supplied prepared meals to the kitchen. You taught me that a plate can be a start, she said, not a destination. Qinghe tucked that sentence into her pocket and kept walking. On a quieter note, the wedding dress apron project had its own small fame. The original couture, repurposed into aprons and tablecloths, was displayed in a small community exhibition. The exhibit title, chosen by a local artist, read, "From stage to table." People lined up to see the cloth that had been turned inside out and stitched into purpose. Children ran their hands along the fabric and giggled. For a town that had once equated dresses with tickets to safety, the transformation felt like an illustration of a truth. Value can be remade. By then, the He family's public posture had evolved. Mr. He gave fewer speeches, but wrote a check for a new refrigeration facility that helped the pilot expand. The matriarch became a consistent, if private, donor. Hyun's name no longer trended like a sensational headline but registered in small circles as someone who had used what he had to shift practices. King's parents came less with plans, and more with curiosities. Her mother enrolled in a sewing class offered by the program, and made aprons for volunteers. Her father, who once measured futures in ledgers, learned to count volunteers and to feel their worth. Their earlier calculations had not been entirely wrong. Security can come in many forms. It can come from alliances formed by shared labor rather than by bought names. As for Ziling, the narrative that had once promised him a role in King's life dissolved into a quieter life of his own making. He remained a figure in the city, but his influence graded into a smaller kind of relevance. Qinghe did not gloat. She had never wanted a downfall. She had wanted dignity. Not every problem was resolved. The city still had waiting lists for shelters. Not every gala signed the Serve Forward pledge. Not every corporate event restructured its plans. But the conversation had changed shapes in a meaningful way. The term waste began to stir new controversies. Not as a personal failing but as an institutional design flaw that could be corrected. And in the café, the counter that had held her steady through storms and bright nights remained the same. New volunteers came through regularly, but the menu stayed honest. People learned that coffee and conversation can be work, and that small acts, measuring beans, offering a cup, handing a plate, are not insignificant. Sometimes, when the light through the alley hit the steam just right, Qinghe remembered the first time she had poured coffee for a man who had never expected to be remembered. She thought of how small kindnesses can be bookmarks in a life, and how one act can be the hinge on which other doors open. At the opening of the community kitchen's third expansion, a plaque was mounted near the service window. In plain metal letters it read, "For hands that feed, for hands that serve, for the dignity of being seen." King's name was not on the plaque. She didn't ask for it. She went on making coffee, teaching the young apprentices how to time an espresso shot, how to repair a broken grinder, and how to keep a ledger without losing a heart. Hyun remained a steady presence, not a rescuer, but an ally. Once, in a quiet moment, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a note. Simple. "For the beans. When we need them. For the nights that are long. For the work you did that made others work with heart." There was no ring, no promise. There was acknowledgement and mutual respect. She smiled and tucked the note into her apron pocket next to a small wooden token May had carved for her when the pilot launched. Tokens are for keeping what matters close, not selling it. The city's conversation matured, slowly, as these things do. Other corporations adopted the model, with different degrees of sincerity. Some programs faltered, others grew. People rediscovered the mundane fact that food could be a currency of care, rather than an item for display. One rainy afternoon, months after the gala that had changed a night and then a year, a reporter asked Qinghe if she felt like an unlikely hero. The question landed with a small thud. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm someone who notices when a bowl is empty, and does what she can do about it. Anyone who sees and acts is doing the same job." It was not falsified humility, it was the honest architecture of her life. When the clip of her carrying plates had first spread, it had been framed in many ways. Now, months later, the image sat, among other images. Chefs in aprons, at dawn, preparing rescued produce, volunteers teaching budgeting to teens, refrigerators humming in a neighborhood that would not have them before. The visual ecosystem had thinned some of the earlier spectacle. If there was a romantic end, it was not a closing of a chapter, but an opening to an arrangement of partnership and mutual respect. He never demanded her loyalty. She never extended it as currency. They worked together when they could and kept separate lives when they could not. Their relationship, whatever it might yet become, stood beside the work, not above it. When the anniversary of the gala came around, the Serve Forward initiative released a report, Numbers Matter for Sustaining Programs. Meals distributed, partnerships formed, reduction of event waste quantified. The report was dry in places, and celebratory in others. Among the graphs and tables someone had placed a photograph at the center. A shot taken the night of the banquet, candid and unposed King in the doorway, carrying a tray. Volunteers lined outside. He stepping into the light. The caption beneath read, "An evening that taught us the difference between giving and showing." Qinghe read it, and placed the report on the café counter. A child she'd taught to fold napkins asked her a question about safety and measurements. She answered, patient, hands moving with the same care she had always used. The city, the company, the families, they all continued to bargain, and to revise, and to try. Systems are large and slow. Courage is small and immediate. Both are necessary. And somewhere between the clang of pots and the hiss of steam, a man once used to making spectacle realized that the true spectacle was the daily work of feeding a neighbor without cameras watching. He realized, too, that being kinda required practice and commitment, not simply a public speech. A spring unfurled. The neighborhood's shelves were fuller, the kitchen hummed, and the café's chalkboard read, "Plain black coffee. Always true." May hung a small sign that said, simply, "We serve." If you were moved by this story, if the idea of turning surplus into sustenance struck a chord, consider finding or supporting a local food rescue group in your area. Small actions, volunteering, donating safely recoverable food, or simply sharing responsibly sourced information can help turn waste into meals and spectacle into service.